Hello, everyone. Welcome to our LinkedIn Live event today. I'm Peter Hirst, Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education at the MIT Sloan School of Management. We just went live, so I'm just going to wait for a few seconds to allow people to catch up and start watching the stream. Again, I'm Peter Hirst. Welcome to Managing in the Hybrid Workplace, our latest LinkedIn Live webinar from MIT Sloan Executive Education. We're going to be talking today, as the title suggests, about the challenges that we have all been discovering and exploring as the face of our workplace has changed. Many of us would think irrevocably from 9 to 5 or indeed 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or longer kind of in-place work hours to much more complex and hybrid workplaces. And it's a topic that obviously is very meaningful to all of us in our own work, and also from the point of view of thinking about what are the implications for our organizations and indeed for society as a whole. And to help us think about these questions today, I am delighted to be joined by two colleagues from the MIT Sloan School of Management, Professor Thomas Kochan and Robert Bob Pozen. Let me start by introducing Tom Kochan. Tom is a post-tenure George Maverick Bunker Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Now, if you're not completely familiar with the lingua franca of academia, post-tenure, I think is supposed to mean a kind of a form of retirement. But as you'll see, Tom is anything but retired in any meaningful way in terms of the work that he actually does. His work focuses on the need to update America's work and employment policies, our institutions and practices to catch up with the changing workforce and economy. He's got many decades devoted to the study of these things. And so incredibly timely for us to be able to be joined by him today for today's discussion. Tom also has a new executive education course called Leading the Future of Work, which is going to have its first run in March. You can find more information about that on our website. Also today, I'm joined by Bob Posen. Bob's a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management currently, and most relevant to today's discussion, his 2012 book entitled Extreme Productivity, Boost Your Results, Reduce Your Hours, was very highly acclaimed and was followed more recently by Remote Inc., How to Thrive at Work Wherever You Are, which again is obviously incredibly timely for and important for today's conversation. Bob's a very accomplished and successful executive before he became an academic with us at the Sloan School. In 2004, he was the executive chairman of MFS Investment Management, a very significant financial services company here in New England and globally. Bob is a very accomplished executive, as well as now with us, a very sought after and accomplished educator. So Bob, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on this LinkedIn Live. It's always a pleasure to get to talk with you individually, and to have the opportunity to talk with both of you together is just fantastic. And I know this will be a great experience for everyone who's joining us today via LinkedIn. And it's good to see many of you there. Please do keep saying hello on the comments on LinkedIn. Let us know where you are and what questions, if any, you have that you'd like to put to Bob and to Tom. I'll do my best to keep an eye on those comments and read a few of them out as they come in. But while you're doing that, why don't I start out by asking a leading question to Tom and Bob, and just starting with the biggest one, which is why in the aftermath of the pandemic, when we all pretty much that could work remotely, why do some CEOs want their employees to come to the office full time again? What's going on? Tom, what's your view of that?
Well, thank you, Peter, and it's great to do this, Bob, with you and with Peter. This is clearly a very pertinent and timely issue, and one that is all-encompassing. I think, Peter, to answer your question, old patterns change very slowly, and sometimes old minds change even slower. And so a lot of executives still have this notion of my job as the executive, as the manager, is to make sure that the work is done and to control the workforce and to have some visible signs that the work is being done. And so this notion that people should be on site for a certain number of hours has been ingrained in us, ever since the manufacturing sector and the industrial sector developed, and we weren't just working on our farms at home. And so now we're in a different world, and there's no question that this world has changed, is changing, and will continue to evolve. That we've demonstrated that there's an opportunity for more flexibility, that we can work in different places for some jobs, not all jobs. That's a challenge that executives and all of us face. But I do think that we are learning as we go. And so our job is to be flexible enough to absorb what we are learning, to learn from our mistakes, and then to see what the workforce wants. I call this part of a process of renegotiating the social contract at work. When do we work? How do we work? How do we work together? How do we work these issues out together? Not in an adversarial way, but in a collegial way, to say we have to make sure that arrangements can be developed and adapted that work for everyone. That's an exciting opportunity, but it means we've got to all be open to change.
Peter, when I speak to CEOs, you're right to say a number of them really want people to come back to work full-time or near full-time. I hear a few arguments. One is what Tom was referring to, is they're worried about accountability. They feel they want to control the situation, and they feel if people are present, that keeps more accountability. It's like if they're not physically present, how do we know that they're not going off fishing or going to the beach? So that's a pretty obsolete notion, because we're really more interested in outputs than inputs. So we really need to get away from that. The second thing is a lot of them say what I call the apprenticeship model. They feel like the way the young people learn is by being physically present and watching their seniors. And I think this is true to some degree, but you can also learn from seeing people on Zoom or seeing people by video. And lastly, you hear this amorphous call for culture. They're worried that that the companies will lose their culture if people don't come in. But I think we have to pin that down a lot more. And I think there is a degree of social interaction that is important for culture, but it doesn't have to be 5 days a week. And that's why I think gradually most companies will move to a hybrid model in which workers will come in 2 or 3 days a week. Last thing I want to say is I think the idea that the CEO should set a uniform rule for everybody in the company really doesn't make sense. Because if you think about it, most companies are essentially an aggregation of teams in which the teams have very different functions. I mean, think about it. An IT team where people are doing coding is very different than a customer service team, than a marketing team, than a financial analyst team. And so really what makes more sense in my view is for the team to make the decision about what's the right balance between remote and in the office. It's really not something where the CEO can say, okay, this is the role for everybody. I mean, some workers will be doing manufacturing and they have to be present. That's so different than people who are in a call center, then they can be almost anywhere.
Let me just build a bit on what Bob just said, these last 2 points about the importance of teams, and then about the differentiation between those who have to be on site given the nature of their occupation and their jobs. That I think that I completely agree that we have to address these issues at the level of the team, at the natural work unit, where work is interdependent. And in order to get the job done, these interdependencies have to be managed, and they have to be managed as a team. And that's a new skill for supervisors and managers. In the past, yes, we worked as a team, but we were all present as a team, and we worked out issues as needed. And that was a little less complex than right now, when we have some people who have needs at home, or we want to work hybrid schedules and they're not all the same. That's a big, big challenge. And it's an opportunity for team building itself. Say, let's put this together. Let's work at it. Let's adjust it as needed. But we all have to really resolve these issues together ourselves. That's a way to build a new culture of cooperation, and a new culture of mutual respect for our differences in our work and our family, and maybe our physical commuting and so on situation. I think that's really an opportunity. I think the biggest difficulty we face, though, is almost all organizations will have some people, the people who clean our rooms, the people who deliver the food, and people who maintain security and so on, whose very occupation and job requires them to be on site for their full work hour segments. And then some of us who are able to work more flexibly. We have to think about flexibility, not just in terms of who's working remotely and who's working on site, but how do we build in some flexibility in different ways for the people who have to be on site? We've learned over the time from organizational experiments and change efforts that you can have flexible hours, but again, that has to be worked out given the nature of the occupational and job functions. But that doesn't mean we can't reward people with a little bit more flexibility in terms of hours of work, schedules, time off when needed for family or other responsibilities. If we don't deal with that issue, then we're going to have a two-class workforce and some real hard feelings at the workplace that won't necessarily surface because there's not much people can do about them, but they'll be there.
Thank you. So just building a little further on that, I'm interested, Bob, to hear your perspective on this idea of enabling teams to figure out what's the best set of working arrangements to enable them to be effective. Would you advocate, though, that the team needs to actually establish a norm which applies to everyone in the team, or do you think it can be successful to have essentially individualized arrangements in the context of those teams? So even if people are doing similar kinds of work or identical work within the context of a team, could they still have very different working arrangements?
Well, I think that if you're at the team level, there ought to be some team norms. And I think that the individual has to be willing to subordinate to the team. The team has to decide which days you're going to come in, and it obviously makes sense for the team to come the same days. And if somebody can't do that, or they don't want to do that, then that's a real problem. So I think that the team has to set certain norms. What hours are you going to be on if you're remote? How fast you have to respond to internal emails and external emails. When you ought to use phone, when you ought to use email, when you ought to use Slack channels. So I think there's certain ground rules that everyone in the team has to follow. And I do believe the team has to agree to a certain number of days in the office and to agree on which days those are.
Great. So you mentioned some factors there. What are the factors that you think are most important? And maybe you first, Bob, and then Tom, you could weigh in terms of deciding what is the optimal design. What's the list of things to think about?
Yeah. So if we agree, and I think we do, that most companies will be in a hybrid model. Then the question is how to design it. And the first thing we've said is that it should be done at the team level. But what are the factors? So I wrote an article suggesting an acronym, FLOCS, FLOCS. So the first and the most important is the function of the team. If the team is like in an ad agency where wants to do a lot of brainstorming, there's a lot of creative work, or if you're in a situation where you have to closely coordinate among team members, well, that's a factor that would strongly militate toward being in the office. But on the other hand, there are certain teams in which people are doing extended work that requires individual concentration. And in that case, that would be best done at home. So the function of the team is the single most important question. The second most important is location. So if you have people who are all living around a metropolitan area, then coming into the office is pretty easy. But we have global teams, we have national teams. So it's not feasible to have them coming in every week. So I'd like to advocate that they try to get together every month for national teams, maybe every quarter for global teams. So location's a big issue. A third is organization. How much is this team self-sufficient, and how much does it have to interact with other teams in the organization? That interdisciplinary aspect, which is really important, militates toward coming in a little more. C is culture, and we've talked about that a little. It's a hard thing to grasp, but we need people to have some sort of social bonds. But these can be done somewhat by video. We have people who have done very creative things, like having cooking lessons together, or having wine tastings together, or playing games by video. So you can help build culture by that, those sorts of activities. Though in the end, having some things where you actually come to the office and meet, that's important. And the last is S, is scheduling, which is the practical question of getting people to come to the office on the same days. So I think, again, the team is the right decision maker. It's not the CEO for the whole company. It's not totally individualistic. It's the team. And these are the 5 factors that every team should consider.
I would add to that. I think those are really important conditions. To also do a really thorough analysis of the flow of work and the projects that one group or one team or the organization has to carry out over a period of time. So, for example, back in our own home university setting, we obviously have some flows of work when people really need to be there to register the students, to get them in to orientation, to get them into their classes. And then as instructors, obviously we have to be there on campus when the students are scheduled to meet with us in class or in our offices. And though there's no substitute for those, and so if we organize our time and we work through the team requirements of those natural flows compared to, let's say, the summer months when it's a little lighter, or some other time periods. And every organization and will have its own flow like that. But to be sensitive to that, and to be able to think in those terms rather than in a weekly work schedule or a bi-weekly work schedule, I think that's an opportunity to open up new ways of working in flexible ways. The second thing I would say about the ways in which we can be flexible for those who are not in position to work at home and this is a question that's already come up in the chat, is to think about different time schedules. We're now into 4-day work weeks for some, 3-day work weeks. We have healthcare professionals in my family who work 12-hour shifts and like it a lot because it allows them to balance their partner and parenting responsibilities. We have split shifts where people are working morning and evening because of different kinds of situations and needs. We have a lot more we can do by project to recognize that we've got a defined set of projects here, or a defined project. It's going to really require concentrated time. All hands have to be on deck. And when that project is completed, we can maybe reward people for good work and take a bit more time off, or at least flexibility in terms of when people come to work. And so I think it requires a conscious analysis of the flow of the work, the flow of our deadlines, and when we can have more flexibility to think about scheduling in different ways. And that's going to raise its own complications, and there'll be some hiccups. So we then have to be able to adjust and repair when we overstep one way or another. But that's all the learning process.
Thanks, Tom. And given your wealth of work on in the area of sort of industrial relations and workforce management, I'm curious what you're finding are the impacts and implications for questions of inclusion and diversity in the realm of hybrid work as well. And one of the questions in the chat was, isn't this just a perk for certain kinds of people, and how do we ensure that this is really an opportunity to increase fairness rather than increase differentiation?
Well, I think that's a really important question, and we saw this in the worst phases of the pandemic. We're still experiencing serious aspects of it, where we invented a new word called essential workers. And as I talked to lots of people who were deemed essential, they don't feel that they've been treated as essential workers. Yes, they got all kinds of accolades. You see this particularly in healthcare, where obviously the stress and the tension of the long hours and all of the psychological and physical stresses that they experience. And now they're sort of back to normal, but they don't feel that they have been appreciated. Maybe their ideas for changing how we do our work were listened to during the pandemic out of necessity. They invented new ways of working together, and now they're back to the old norms. And that's really frustrating, particularly for those people who are essential or were deemed essential. And you also see it in the retail area, where workers have to be there to in the food stores and others, and they absorbed an enormous amount of tension from their customers. And they're very frustrated with not getting the support of management in dealing with some of those tensions. Flight attendants, we see this as we travel, the enormous stresses that they've had to absorb in telling people they have to wear their masks, or whatever the rules are, with the increased capacity problems with baggage, the delays, all of the problems that we're seeing in the airlines. Enormous concern that they have not been treated fairly and not been appreciated. Sometimes it's as simple, and I don't use that word too loosely, as paying them a little bit more. Yes, there have been some premiums for having to work during the pandemic. Then a lot of companies pulled them back, and when they pulled them back, they did that to the dismay of the workforce that felt, they're putting in their time, and they're now working at a higher level, and the stresses haven't seemed to have gone away. So sometimes talking about compensation, but again, it's much more respect. It's listening to the workforce, listening to their ideas for how we can make it through this, and how we can work effectively together, how we can adjust our patterns and our scheduling. and then continuing to do that as we go forward, not just seeing this as a temporary response to a crisis, and now we can move back to a more normal, whatever that was, arrangement. That's where people are very upset. That's where we're seeing this hybrid work leading to the so-called Great Resignation and to some of the collective worker activism that we're seeing, because people are saying, "Gee, there are organizations out there that do this, seem to do this better, and I've had time to think about my circumstances, and I'm going to move to them." That combines with tight labor markets. That may change in the weeks and months ahead, but the expectations are so much higher, and those expectations aren't going to dissipate just because the labor market softens and maybe alternatives aren't quite as attractive out there. They're going to remain there for those people who have lived through this time period, the same way generations before us were imprinted by their experiences during the Great Depression and how that influenced their concern for security and other things in the rest of their careers. This experience is going to imprint our workforce today and into the future with new sets of expectations that have to be met.
That's helpful. Thank you. And one of the overlays that is happening simultaneously with this, that we've also many of us been both struggling with and seeing as an opportunity that we need to seize, is the desire to ensure that we're having greater equality of access to opportunities in work and our organizations, to do what we can to ensure that we're creating diverse workforces and inclusive work experiences. Do you think that that the move towards hybrid work is helping or hindering those efforts? And if so, how? Maybe Bob, you've got the perspective as an executive on that, and Tom, I know as a researcher, you've got some data about this. I'd love to hear more about it.
Well, I think hybrid work has both positives and negatives. It's positive because there are people who need some more flexibility. They need to be at home. They could be taking care of children, or they could be taking care of elderly parents. So it gives them a chance to continue to be in the workforce. They don't have to drop out of the workforce. And so that's a force toward more equality. On the other hand, I think there is an issue when you have a team that's partially in the office and partially at home. In every situation I've seen, there are some people who will come to the office every day. They like coming to the office. It may help structure their day. They may have a short commute. And so then you run, the question is, so should these meetings be run by video? Should they be run in person? And I guess partly it's just a question of numbers. If you have most of the people in the office, well, then it's perfectly reasonable to be on time. But if it's half and half, I think you have to move toward a video meeting. The other thing that I think can be very helpful is some sort of buddy system. If there are people who, for a variety of reasons, can only come into the office a relatively small number of days, they may feel like they're being left out. They don't hear about promotion opportunities. They don't hear the informal scuttlebutt about how the company's really moving in this direction or that direction. They may not have a feel for the new products. So in that case, having an in-person or on-site buddy for the people who are remote can help reduce that feeling that they're out of the flow.
Mm-hmm. I like Bob's point about having a buddy system. I think that's a really, really creative idea. But let me add one area where, surprisingly, I guess this was new to us, at least as a researcher. It was new to me, so I'll leave everybody else out. The data are telling us very clearly that some people feel much more inclusive in the hybrid setting where we use Zoom or whatever technology we choice to participate. And who are those people? They tend to be minorities, they tend to be women, and they tend to be younger people. Now, why is it that those groups? Well, I think it's because they feel that they are the sort of the junior partners. They aren't listened to in meetings. Maybe they're not even invited to some in-person meetings in the past where they feel they should be part of the discussion. But now the technology allows for us to manage groups online in much more egalitarian ways, if we choose to manage that way. That requires, again, those of us who are managing and leading the conversations to have some skills with this technology that we're using here today to make sure that we are reaching people. But there's more opportunities. The chat, as we're seeing here, the raised hands options, the various ways of expressing an interest in having something to say are a bit more egalitarian, and people can feel a little bit more confident in getting their voices heard. That surprised me, frankly. I had never thought about that as a mode for increasing communication and increasing egalitarianism in meetings. But it also allows us a little bit better ability, or gives us a little more ability to equalize the contributions. So if we have someone like me who probably tends to speak up too much in meetings and maybe even dominate in some discussions, well, as a moderator, Peter, you can tell me that, thank you, Tom, for that comment. Now I'm going to Bob, or I'm going to someone else. And you can manage it a little bit more readily if you choose to do so. So I think there are some equalizing opportunities. I'm delighted to see those data, and you can feel it sometimes in these meetings as well.
That's interesting. You started talking there about management essentially, and how we manage. Bob, in your book, and in your executive education course, you talk a lot about trying to move from measuring inputs to measuring outcomes, essentially, as being really fundamental shift that many managers really need to grapple with to be successful in this realm. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, that's probably the main theme of what I've been pushing for the last few years is, it's surprising how many companies are still counting hours. Um, Obviously, there are some like law firms and accounting firms that are billing by the hour, but even that is starting to be questioned. But there are so many companies that are still talking about how many hours are you in the office? Are you in 9 to 6? Or some companies are actually putting this monitoring software on your computer or your phone to see how many hours are you on your computer, or how many hours are you on your phone. And this, in my view, is just a misguided attempt to sort of come up with some measure of productivity. And hours seems like it's got some relationship to productivity. It's easy to measure. It's done historically, but actually it's pretty lousy measure when you think about it. In a knowledge economy, and most of us on this webinar are in a knowledge economy, it's more important what you get accomplished, your output, than the input. When I was president of Fidelity Investments, I had one analyst who came in at 4 a.m. in the morning, and then he left at 9 a.m. And people say, well, how could you let him do that? Most people come in different hours. And my view was, well, what is the quality of his recommendations? And if he had great stock picks, what do I care whether he comes in at dawn or he comes in at midnight? What I'm interested in is what his output is, subject to, occasional team meeting. But what we really ought to do is focus on outputs. And what I talk about in my book and in the course is, well, how do we translate that general idea of outputs into the team? And I think the answer is something I call success metrics. Uh, the team leader knows better than the team what the team needs to do to fit in with the organizational goals. But she then has to turn to the team and say, well, how are we going to know in 2 weeks or a month at the end of the project, whatever the time frame is, how are we going to know whether we've been successful or not? And really to work with the team in coming up with specific success metrics. I've done this a lot of times, and what's interesting is if you take, any objective and you ask people, well, what would you decide are the success metrics? There's a huge dispersion of results. People have beneficial. There are at least three major benefits, I believe. One is you clarify what the goals of the team are. A lot of objectives that are stated, like improve customer service or increase revenues, they're general and people don't know exactly what they're supposed to do. So having success metrics really clarifies that. The second thing is that it helps the team leader not micromanage, which I have found is probably one of the biggest problems of middle managers. They have a hard time giving up control. But if they know what the success metrics are, then they're much more likely to be able to give up control because they know at the end they'll either hit the success metrics or not. And then this question that we've been discussing that Tom has raised about flexibility in schedule. Well, success metrics really gives you a lot more flexibility because once you decide what those success metrics are, then it's up to you when and where and how you achieve them. The team or the boss doesn't have to tell you every day what to do. At the end of the project or the end of the month, if you hit those success metrics, then it's up to you as to what sort of the way you do it, the timing you do it, and the place you do it. So that's why I see success metrics as a real benefit to most organizations.
Great, thanks, Bob. And Tom, Bob started to talk there about the role of the manager and perhaps how that is changing or needs to change. And in the chat, Melanie asked us about how to manage situations where perhaps managers are not doing what we would like them to do in creating the sort of work environments that are positive that we're talking about here. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we are seeing a tremendous growth in employee voice initiatives around the country, indeed around the world, as I talk to my colleagues in other countries. And so this is an opportunity where employees are speaking up today on issues that they've never felt they had an ability to speak up. Some of it is in organizing and trying to form a union, but a lot of it is just listen to us and hear our voices, hear our concerns, raise the issue, hold our managers accountable, and hold our higher level managers accountable. And you see this in some of our biggest high technology companies today, where people want to have a voice in how management is living up to the values of their organization or the espoused values. Are they selling the kinds of products and services that we can be proud of? Are we meeting our customer expectations? Are we addressing the social issues that we are experiencing and concerned about, whether it's gender issues, racial justice, issues around the abortion decisions, and so on? These are the things that are on people's mind, and the manager today has to be good and open to listening to those voices, to engaging them, not to then going back into his or her own community and saying, I'll decide now what to do about them, but to use this as an opportunity to reach more consensus around what to do and to report up to other levels of management. Here are the voices of the workforce that we've got to address if we are going to have a highly committed, highly motivated workforce and retain the talent that is so essential to our business. So I think management is changing. The role of managers today is changing more profoundly than it has for many, many years. And that's an opportunity. It's a responsibility of those of us in business schools to prepare this and the next generation of managers for these increased expectations. But it's an opportunity to unleash an enormous amount of energy, motivation, and wisdom from the workforce. If we try to squelch it, well, then obviously you get a much more militant response. So I think it's an opportunity to do that, but it's a different management style.
We've been getting some questions about, to what extent do these ideas apply or impacted by more globally sort of organized and distributed sort of companies and businesses, and that might also speak to other sort of different national cultures and that play into this. And I was also struck by one question that my mind relates to this: that aren't we just creating an environment which is going to lead to the 24-hour, 7 days a week work pattern for people? And if that's not a good thing, maybe you think it is a good thing. But if it's not a good thing, how do we resist that inexorable force that many of us are perhaps feeling to always be on? Bob, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think we're talking, and Tom is emphasizing, we need a much more proactive team leader. And if you have a global workforce, you've got to establish some norms. And one of them has to be the people aren't expected to be on 24/7. It's just crazy. Now, it may be complicated to figure out what are the overlapping hours of people who are in different time zones, but we ought to sort of think of that as, it's like coming into the office 2 days a week. We have certain overlapping hours every day, let's say, 3 or 4 hours where everybody in the team needs to be on because those are the overlapping hours. But once you get away from that core overlapping hours, you can then say it's up to people then, after that, to achieve the success metrics, how and where and when they want to. So I think that's one of the things. A second thing is to establish these norms, like you're not expected to return an email within 20 minutes. You're not expected to return emails that come to you after 7 p.m. at night unless there's a true emergency. And so, you can really convey that in a very concrete manner that's important. A third thing that I think I would say about global companies is it's good to have certain nodes, certain centers. So you could have a global company. I mean, I'm involved with one that has an office in London, has an office in Frankfurt, has an office in San Francisco. And so there are 3 sort of concentrated areas where people are gathering. And maybe there would be one in Asia also. So you can try to sort of have nodes where people are getting together regionally every week or once a month or something like that. So that's a way to sort of make a global company feel more tied together. But in the end, it's the team leader's responsibility to make sure that people don't work 24/7. And there's a big difference between saying, here are 3 hours every day for 5 days for the business days, which are overlapping. We need everybody to be on then. That's about all that I think a team leader should require. After that, people should be on their own to figure out what's the best way for them to work.
Peter, you mentioned some cultural differences. I think Bob did a great job of talking about how you deal with the different time zones, but we have sort of cultural zones of concern too. As you know, I've spent time working in China, and I've spent a lot of time working in and with Korean colleagues. And without drawing stereotypes, there are some cultures where management is much still of a more authoritarian nature. And the notion that the old notion that people don't leave until the boss leaves the office, well, that's a particular problem today. And the notion that we may have some expats who are stationed in a culture like that, who now all of a sudden have to deal with a set of expectations that are very different than what we're talking about here. We have to be sensitive to that. We have to both help people who are stationed in subsidiaries or partners or working in other cultural settings to understand what they are experiencing and to help them deal with it. At the same time, we have to help our colleagues in other settings to understand what we're talking about here, because the younger workforce in those countries, as I've experienced them and as the data suggests, are just as interested in flexibility as the people in New York, Cincinnati, and San Francisco. And so the world is changing. But again, these cultural traditions and managerial traditions change slowly. We're going to have to be a bit patient with some of our colleagues around the world. But I don't think that we have to absolve them in some way from dealing with it. If we are going to have a truly global set of operations and a global workforce and a global business, then we've got to set some norms and work with our colleagues in other countries to adapt their traditions to fit the changes in the world, but maybe be understanding of where they're coming from and a little patient in how to work that out.
You talked there about national cultural characteristics and patterns.
Yes.
Obviously, there are big differences even between organizations, in each of those contexts as well. From all of your work helping organizations really make change together, Tom, have you got any advice on how to change the culture of an organization in the ways that you're talking about?
Well, I think the key is to bring diverse groups together. Too often, CEOs talk to CEOs. They get in their comfortable peer group. Middle managers do the same, and workers do the same. And that creates some cohesion and some solidarity that is useful, but it also creates stereotypes, divisions, misunderstandings, missed opportunities to really learn from each other and to communicate. Now, when we bring diverse groups together, which I've done throughout my career, you've got to have skills in facilitating those differences, in respecting them, in mediating them in some ways, and working through to solutions, and being a bit patient in working them through. So so bringing these diverse groups together inside an organization, and in fact, sometimes in an industry where you see these variations, and you see organizations that are doing it very well, that others can learn from. But you've got to bring people who respect each other from these different settings together to listen to what's working, to experiment with it, to bring others into the organizations that are doing a better job of it, to see how it's working. So it's not just a one-on-one effort to change. The example of this would be in the auto industry. For a number of years, we would know that there are some really good plants and some better managed companies than others. And the companies that wanted to learn from them didn't just send one person, they sent a team of people to maybe work there for a while, to learn from it, and then come back as a team and say, now let's try to bring about some change here. We can't do this easily as individuals, but we can do it as teams and as groups, that as we've all been emphasizing here. So recognizing that we can learn from each other, but it's a social process of then diffusing that learning that requires some people who are going to come back and then fight the battles with the more resistant groups and be able to bring about change.
Great. And Bob, I'm wondering, Laura asked in the chat if she made the observation that US-based companies tend to notice that people around the world start sort of marching to the schedule of the US company. It's almost a new form of cultural imperialism, perhaps. Is that something, Bob, that you've noticed in the sort of multinational organizations
Yeah, well, I think probably where a company is headquartered tends to be the notion that at least you look at their hours and try to coordinate other hours with that. I think that's partly a U.S. problem because we do that if we're U.S. centric. But I think it's also true if you have a company in London, then they'll sort of tend to ask people to coordinate and sort of have those hours be convenient for the headquarters company. So I do think it's partly a problem in the US, but I think it's more a headquarters problem, and that the headquarters has to be sensitive to how many people are in these other sites. Sometimes the headquarters only has 100 people, and there are literally thousands of people in other places. So then it wouldn't make sense to focus on what's convenient in terms of the hours of the headquarters. But I think if people uh, are sensitive to where the most people in the team are located and try to work off that, that's probably the best way.
Mm-hmm. Peter, there's maybe one issue we haven't really talked about as much. We've kind of emphasized the challenge of managing with the teams and maybe with people that report to us. But there's an equal challenge of middle managers and higher level executives managing upward. And I hear this from executives a lot, particularly now because the world of employee relations is changing, and the CEOs and the top financial people, or maybe some of the others, don't have much experience in these areas. And so we've got to be able to manage our way upward to say, here are the new metrics that we want to be held accountable for, as Bob has written and said so clearly today. The new metrics of performance and projects, and not, some standard things that might have been reasonably okay in the past, but they may not be responsive today. And let me just illustrate it, I suppose, with the obvious. My favorite CEO, because he keeps giving me good material for talks like this, Elon Musk. Who can speak to an egotistical top level executive like that, who says, not only am I going to get rid of a whole bunch of people, which I think is just an abhorrent human resource management, breaks every principle we believe in, but also then says, and by the way, everybody who's going to stay or wants to stay is going to have to work these long hours because I work these long hours. Well, of course he might work these long hours, but that's his choice. And you can't impose that anymore. And you have to have enough power of high level and middle level executives saying to the Elon Musks of the world, and people who aren't quite as extreme, that that will not work today. And you've got to give us the flexibility to do all of the things that we're talking about here today, or we will lose an enormous amount of our talent. And I think that's a challenge that we need to address. How do we manage upward?
That's a good question. Bob, you've often sat at the top of organizations. What do you think is effective?
Well, I think, we are having a new set of CEOs who are less the imperial CEO in the prior mode. And I think I was just with a CEO of a big company last night at a leadership course that I was giving. And he emphasized how much time he spends on people management. And I think, I'm a great fan of these 360 reviews where top managers not only hear about the people above them, they hear about the people below them, and they start to get feedback in a different way. And I feel like if we can have more 360 reviews, then the top managers will start to understand a little more about how they're coming over. Sometimes when I'm talking to top managers, they're telling me they spend all their time positively reinforcing the people working for them. But if you talk to them, the people who work for them, it doesn't quite come over that same way. So I think we need to have a mechanism, and a 360 review is one way in which you can start to broach these issues with top management.
Tom, are there any other sort of good practices that we could all be, even locally, within our own sort of domain of influence and control, be trying to implement around this?
Well, I see this in some of our own community affairs. And we're talking about our work and professional and occupational responsibilities. But increasingly, we have to adapt our other institutions as well in our communities. And so many of us sit on this board or that board or committee in our communities or in nonprofits or whatever we happen to be doing. And we've got to make sure that those activities are also being opened up to people with scheduling challenges and family responsibilities. And the new technologies allow us to do that better, because we can do hybrid meetings, but then we require the skills. So city council meetings, planning board meetings, finance committees for our churches or synagogues and so on. These kinds of things are opportunities to also bring the skills we're talking about, the technologies we're talking about, and the practices we're talking about into our lives and into the lives of our neighbors and our community colleagues. I think that's as important an issue. Otherwise, we again will find smaller numbers of people volunteering to take on those important roles to make our civil society work. And so I think we have to pay attention to that.
Great, thank you.
I reminded Peter of the quote from Peter Drucker, who said, "You don't have to love your boss, you don't even have to like your boss, but you need to manage your boss." And I think
I like that.
as we're moving into new realms here, that's what you really have to learn to do. It's not easy, but you've got to start to manage your boss, to move your boss away from hours, away from inputs and to outputs. One thing I suggest is, well, try it with one project with your boss and see how it works. That's a way to start to persuade your boss that this is actually a better way to run an organization.
There's a version of that I've heard as well, which is to treat your boss as your most important customer. I'm not sure I have that, but
I like that. I like that, Peter.
So in our final few minutes, while we're just closing out here, I think thank you both. This has been a really interesting conversation, and you've put forward a number of, I think, very practical ideas and provoked us to think about some of the very important consequences that this really is an important issue for us to grapple with. If there's one thing that I'll ask each of you in turn, if there's one thing that you would recommend anybody by the time they've kind of finished watching this recording or this live broadcast could or should do when they close this window and return to whatever it was they were doing, whether that's work or home based, what would be the thing that you suggest that they should do to move the ball forward for them for themselves on hybrid work? Tom first, and then Bob.
I would say experiment. We've had a natural experiment with having to adapt to these changes, and we've learned as we've gone along. And I think we have to continue that. We have to continue to try new things, collect enough information from enough people to see how it's working, and hard data to make sure that our businesses and our organizations are performing at peak performance, and then adapt accordingly. But we're in a period where we can continue to break some new patterns and or old patterns and break some new ground. And I think experimentation with data collection, with conversation about what we learn is the way to go.
Well, I just chime in. I agree with Tom, but I go back to my point is in your own organization, try to get away from counting hours. Move from counting hours to success metrics. Think about what you really want to get accomplished and focus on those things rather than how many hours you are at the office or at home or working. Uh, get that tough discussion about what you really want to accomplish and how you're going to measure it so that everybody can feel comfortable that you're really accomplishing those things.
Great. Thank you, Thomas Kochan. Thank you, Bob Posen, for spending this hour with us and sharing your insights and wisdom. And thank you all around the world who have been tuning in and participating in the conversation as well. We really appreciate that. And these kinds of activities, as a final plug, I would suggest are an important part of what we can do as well, which is, to make sure that we keep exposing ourselves to new ideas and finding ways to be able to keep learning as well. If we don't keep learning, we're not going to be able to keep up with these changes, yet alone drive them and control them in the ways that I hope we should all want to. So once again, thank you, Tom and Bob. This has been fantastic. And the final reminder, everyone, you can see Tom in his online asynchronous multi-week course, which you can find on the Executive Education website. That I think runs in March. And Bob has a regular course with us as well in Executive Education on maximizing your personal productivity. Next run is going to be, I think, on campus.
Right. We're back on
campus. Together, it still has a purpose. And if you'd like to come to MIT and get together with us, then please look out for that course as well. So once again, Tom, Bob, thank you so much. Any final words?
No, thank you, Peter. It was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. We look forward to having more conversations like this. It's an ongoing learning experience. I totally agree with you.